Welcome to our second in our series of interviews with Dr. Jarold K. Zeman, former professor of church history at Acadia Divinity College. Dr. Zeman, we left off our last segment talking about your family. I wonder if you could be a little more specific about the names of your children and your wife's background and her family name, and if you could take us in that direction to begin this discussion.
Thank you. I have said in different contexts of this interview that I have seen so many evidences of God's leading and providence in my life that I cannot but reiterate that in this context, that I'm sure that God opened the door for me to go to Esterhazy, Saskatchewan, and to meet my future wife, Lillian, because her parents, by the name Konchitsky, were also of Czech extraction, and they had come in the late 1920s to Canada and were farmers in the prairies like so many immigrants in those years. And so my wife actually was brought up in the Czech language before she went to the elementary school. When we first met and conversed, she still keeps recalling that she could not understand either my Czech nor my English because of the accent. So it was love at first sight, not at first talk. And I was a gentleman because before we started to correspond, while she was still finishing high school, I wrote to her mother first and asked her permission if I could correspond with her daughter. That was an age of chevaliers that doesn't exist these days, I guess. And she had three sisters. One of them died in British Columbia, and the youngest one is still in California, and another one in Ontario. So that has become my only close family in Canada, the siblings of my wife. As for our children, the oldest one, Miriam, became a teacher and is teaching in Mississauga, outside Toronto. She has remained single by choice. The second one, Dagmar, which is a Danish name with Czech connotations. There was a Czech princess and queen, Dagmar. So she works for Michelin in Pictou County, and they have two children. And Timothy, our only boy, was the third child, who lives in the suburbs of Edmonton and teaches school, mainly English. And the youngest one, Janice, is at the University of Maine on the main campus outside Bangor. They're all graduates of, well, three of them are graduates of Acadia, but all of them studied here. They're all musically gifted. In fact, I taught all of them piano, and I taught my son violin as well. And they have maintained their piano, and two of them are very much involved in church life, in New Glasgow Church and the church in Edmonton. So it's really a sense of gratitude to God when one sees so many families where at least one of the child sort of drops out of the Christian influence, hopefully just for a while, and our children have remained faithful to the Lord whom they professed through baptism. One of them in Toronto, the others in the New Minas Baptist Church.
I wonder if we can move on from there to talk a little bit about your own personal convictions and those ideas which have shaped your life in the dynamic that has led you into scholarship and what you've written and how you've taught.
Well, that's a big order. I have said in several contexts that the Bible, to me, is the only reliable source of knowledge of God. It's a revelation. What would we know about Jesus apart from the New Testament? Absolutely nothing. A few passing mentions in the in the Roman sources. So, and because I was converted through reading of the Scriptures, so the Bible has remained for me the full foundation, not only for my convictions, but also for my piety, for my devotional life, for everything. And originally, when I thought of graduate studies, I wanted to teach New Testament. And I did my BD thesis at Knox College in the New Testament. But when I saw how crowded the field was, and that every verse and every word in the New Testament has been turned over 100 times by dissertations, I gave up and switched to church history, for which I had the needed languages and where there was a lot of virgin land unexplored. But I have taught Sunday school classes ever since my conversion. Back in the old country, I used to walk Sunday afternoons to a neighboring village every Sunday, snow or sunshine, to teach a small class of children. And I taught Sunday school in every church I pastored, and I have not kept it up, of course, when I was traveling a lot. But the Bible and its message, I think, is the one reliable source that we have over against two dangers today. And I'm trying to stress this, searching for words. I think we live in a decade, and perhaps more than a decade, when there is an attempt, certainly in ecumenical conversations, to treat church tradition as having almost equal value for the revelation of God as that of through the Scriptures. I mean, that has been the dogmatic position of the Roman Catholic Church ever since the Council of Trent, that God speaks in two ways, through the Bible and also through the church decrees and, in other words, tradition. And I think there is an inclination, from what I read, among many Protestants in the mainline denominations to move in that direction, which is potentially, I think, very erosive to the authority of the Bible, and also very misleading as on some of the specific doctrines, let's say the doctrine of baptism. Because if you want to justify infant baptism, it's very difficult to do it apart from tradition. The same applies to interpretation of ordination and church orders and so on. The other danger that I see posing a threat to the central place of the Bible today is the increasing emphasis on personal experience of spirituality, which then authenticates truth. In other words, both the charismatic movement and the things happening, let's say, in Toronto at the Airport Vineyard Church. But beyond that, even in Baptist circles now, there are many people who, lay people particularly, who talk, when you hear their testimonies, as though their experience really is what they base their knowledge of truth on. God told me this, God revealed this to me. Then when it's combined with the Holy Spirit and people claim that He has revealed to them certain specific truths, well, we're way beyond the Protestant principle of the authority of Scripture over against tradition of the church and over against personal experience. Very slippery ground. And I suppose you could say that I'm very old-fashioned, that I have not moved an inch in my theological development since my conversion, because the Bible was like a bride I married in my youth. But having, I think, read fairly widely, and having been exposed to many currents of theology in my studies in Prague and Canada and then in Switzerland, where I did my doctorate, I still think that if we abandon the Bible, especially the New Testament, as the only authentic norm of truth, we're on very slippery and dangerous ground. Now, in addition to the Bible, of course, I was exposed both to persons who influenced me, the teachers, inevitably. I mentioned the Presbyterian ministers back home, then professors in Prague, two professors at Knox College, and then in Zurich, where I did my doctorate, people like Edward Schweitzer. I took a seminar with Karl Barth, commuting from Zurich to Basel, and Interestingly enough, Barth was dealing with Calvin's defense of infant baptism and shot to pieces Calvin's arguments in the chapter. He said that was the weakest chapter in the Institutes of Christian Religion. And then, of course, Barth has defended believers' baptism both in that early short pamphlet and then in the last fragment volume of his great Church Dogmatics. So I have pleasant memories of some of the teachers, but at the same time, I think that it was the lay people who taught me the deepest lessons, certainly of piety. I can think of some of the old ladies in the Czech church, which I pastored, and in the English-speaking church, Villanova, who were saints. And in my conversations with them and praying with them, I really felt I was on holy ground, often far more than in a seminary. And so I think the laity is the key to a living church, and also it's a source of inspiration, and we must never, I think, fall into the trap of professionalizing the clergy to the extent that it tries to dominate the church as it used to do in the Roman Catholic Church.
When you talk about people who have influenced you, I wonder if you could be a little more specific. I know that in your personal life, we're touched on a number of levels. We're touched intellectually, we're touched in the context of piety, as you've mentioned. Are there some others who you want to just mention?
Well, I think there are only two names that really stand out, I think, in my formation as a church servant and church leader. One was in Toronto, Dr. Dixon Burns, who was the senior secretary under whom I worked, and he became like a father to me since my family was left behind the water. I worked with him 8 years, and I never forget the prayer times we had together when he would kneel down on the carpet in his office, and the rest of us, his associates, would do likewise. He was an advisor, an amazing man who used to teach. He was a pastor, then he taught at Ontario Bible College and eventually became secretary in the convention. The other one was our own Abner Langley here. Abner was an amazing man, and he and I understood each other. We didn't have to say many words. I often dropped into his office, and we would just exchange looks and mention one or two words, and we would know which way the wind is blowing. And we both came to the Divinity College in '68 during the changeover from the School of Theology to the Divinity College, and it was not an easy time because the Divinity College was under suspicion from many circles in the convention. And so the task became, how do we sell, humanly speaking, the Divinity College as deserving the trust of the whole theological spectrum of our pastors and churches. And I think Abner and I worked very hard at that during the early '70s. And I have respected and loved Abner and miss his presence.
Perhaps this is a good time to ask how you came to come to Acadia Divinity College. You had been ministering in Ontario and obviously enjoying the ministry within the denominational setting, but you ended up in Nova Scotia.
Well, a prelude or overture. I think I always wanted to be a university or seminary teacher, something in the genes, in the blood. And I referred to the open doors that God would open. As long as I was pastoring in Toronto, I was hoping to carry on some courses on the side, but it didn't lead anywhere. And then, when I was pastoring the rural church, away from any opportunity to do postgraduate work, one day when I visited the church house in Toronto, Dr. Hillier, the Foreign Mission Secretary, called me into his office and he said, "Jerry, I have a letter here which may be of interest to you. The Baptist Seminary in Switzerland, in Rouge-le-Châne, is offering a scholarship to a Canadian student to come for a year everything paid except travel. Would you be interested? He said, I offered it to McMaster and nobody was interested. Well, that was as though God reached down with his long hand and say, now come on out of the hiding and go back to the books. And so after many weeks of discussion and prayer, Lily and I accepted that because it meant uprooting. We actually left our two first children with grandmother in Saskatchewan. But we went 56 to 57, only on the condition that I could begin my doctorate at the University of Zurich. And so I took courses both at Richricon and Zurich. Well, I didn't finish the dissertation, obviously. And I came back, every intention to work on my dissertation, the contacts between the Anabaptists and the Czech Brethren. I wasn't getting anywhere. So my wife and I made a decision in 1964 that we'll just give up. I guess that's not the way to go. And then I got a phone call or letter from the president of the Richricon Seminary in Switzerland saying, how would you like to come back, teach a course for us each semester and finish your doctorate? Well, what clearer message would anybody want from God than that? So this time we took our 4 children, went to Switzerland for a year. 2 of them went to the Swiss elementary schools and learned German and the Swiss dialect. It was not an easy year for my wife because I was buried in books trying to finish the dissertation, which eventually was published in this form, the Anabaptists and the Czech Brethren. But thank God it was finished. And that's a prerequisite for any teaching. And I think Dr. Burns, who gave me a leave of absence for 1 year, recognized that my gifts were probably more in teaching than administration, and so he encouraged me to go that route. And then Acadia was being reorganized. Dr. Whidden, the former dean and church historian, retired. So I got an inquiry from Dr. Cherry, who was becoming the first dean, whether I would be interested. Well, I sure was. So I came down to Wolfville and was quite impressed, not by the little school that had about 25 students and wasn't too sure which way to go, but by the friendliness and the opportunity in the context of university. So that's how I accepted the call to come here, and we moved on July 1st, 1968, and acquired the house, which in the strange providence of God would 3 years later be right across the street from the new Divinity College building, so that I wouldn't have to walk through deep snow too far in winter.
When you came to the Divinity College, it was that transition time after the province had taken over the university and the School of Theology was still very much up in the air and what was going to happen. Tell us a little bit about that process and maybe some of the tensions that were there at that point in time.
Well, anybody who knows the Divinity College now, with the large faculty and largest student body and secretarial staff and all the different programs, I mean, would have no idea what the School of Theology was back in 1968, 69, when we were meeting in the old Sawyer Hall, an old White House, used to be President Sawyer's residence, next to the library, which had been demolished after we moved up the hill. And there were many tensions and frustrations. There's no question about it. I have touched upon some of that in 2 of the chapters in the book Open Doors that I mentioned earlier. I cherish the friendship of the original faculty, like Charlie Taylor and Dr. Merrick, Dr. Lovesley, Dr. Trites, and Dr. Cherry, of course. I guess that was the whole full-time faculty, and myself. Obvious imbalance, because there were 4 of us in the theoretical fields, New Testament, Old Testament, church history, systematics, and only 2 full-time profs in the practical fields, clinical training and Christian ed. And then Judson Levy, the chaplain, used to teach homiletics. But there were, on the surface, everything looked well, harmonious. I think we enjoyed confidence in each other and respect. but there was definitely a theological spectrum which is probably desirable and healthy for any seminary, so the students have to make their choices as they develop their own course. And I think the major problem was not inside the school, but outside in the constituency. Because during the previous number of years, quite a few candidates for ministry were going to study in the States, Gordon College, Gordon Seminary. And Abner Langley and I think, became the two main salesmen to go around the churches trying to persuade the pastors and the people that things are changing in Acadia. I remember a stormy session in northeast New Brunswick one day with pastors. I was under attack, and it was like an inquisition for about 2 hours about every possible aspect of doctrine and what's going on. But I think it was healthy. I like a good debate. I don't like everything artificially swept under the tablecloth. And it was a slow uphill struggle to persuade pastors and candidates for ministry that they will be safe if they come to our school, that they will have a choice in points of view, but that there certainly is a definite reorientation underway which started, and I think Abner Langley was the key person in that, although I think he was supported by the others. And then the subsequent appointments to the faculty that followed my coming all tended in that direction. So bit by bit, we were able to regain the confidence of our constituency to a large extent, not fully. But more than that, we became known as the only convention of Federation Baptist Seminary in Canada, because McMaster was still quite in the left field theologically. There was no Carey Hall in existence as a seminary in Vancouver, and there was no Ontario Theological Seminary. And so during the second half of the 70s, we were attracting quite a number of students from Ontario. I think we had up to between 15 and 20 students from BCOQ. We also had between a dozen and more students from Western Canada. My wife and I had regular Bible study and prayer meetings in our home every Friday night, and most of them were newcomers from these other parts of Canada. They tended to lean on us because we had that background. And so Acadia became known as a Canadian Baptist seminary, not just maritime. And it was a good cross-fertilization. And of course, we were sent out and we spoke at the different ministers' retreats and conferences all across Canada, selling, really selling Divinity College. The things have changed through the 80s, when Carey Hall was fully developed into a seminary with Regent, when Ontario Theological Seminary appeared and developed its full MDiv program and attracted a large number of students, candidates from BCOQ, and then the changes at McMaster under the present principal, Dr. Brackney. So that makes it, I think, very much more difficult for the Divinity College to keep growing in terms of numbers, because we have lost the potential territory in the center and west of Canada. We also had links with the French churches and used to have French-speaking students. Now they have their own seminary, which is allied with us, as you know. So it has been, I think, a wonderful evolution, not revolution. There was never any revolution. It was a slow, patient evolution from a very small school which was struggling for survival, and there was talk about moving it to Halifax and merging with Pine Hill and so on. And I think the persons in the convention who decided in '68 to risk the sacrifices of supporting our own Maritime Baptist Seminary or Atlantic, I think they were wise in having made that decision, even though it has been very costly in terms of resources.
I'd like to follow up on one of the things that you mentioned. As I've talked to students who were going through the Divinity College in the 70s, they talk about the importance of the Zeman living room. Tell us a little bit about you talked about the Bible studies and the cross-fertilization, but there were a lot of students who found that in a very real sense their spiritual home.
Well, I should mention that we live in a house that was built by a well-known Canadian Maritime Baptist minister, Dr. Mason, who used to be Secretary of Home Missions. In fact, Dr. Mitten and others told me they used to come to that living room, which was an office that Dr. Mason had, to get their field assignments as students at the School of Theology. So it's holy ground. And besides the Bible study group that we have maintained, I imagine, for a decade and a half, both for students and wives, so it was a very nice group, and we met during the school year. But besides that, I used to bring classes into our living room, at least once a semester each class, and often more than that. And we would sit around in a big circle around the fireplace, and I think that's what the students remember. And they would present their short papers, and it was more in a seminar fashion, and we would have discussion and then refreshments in the kitchen, which maybe they remember more than the living room teaching. But I have very fond memories of that. And I think more could be done. When the classes grew bigger, it became a problem. For instance, the class on Couts that I taught, which used to fill the Langley room, the big, I mean, there was no way you could bring them home, but most of the other classes I could. And my wife enjoyed getting to know the students because she was involved with the Divinity Wives for a while as the advisor. Very happy memories. Not only the friendships that are surviving long after they have graduated, but the prayer life together, and the assurance that students have been praying for me in times of my critical sicknesses.
Dr. Zeman, time seems to go so quickly, and it seems that we've come to the end of segment 2. Thank you very much for sharing with us, and we will look forward to the next segment as we begin to talk about your expanding role in the context of ministry out of the Divinity College.